Hi, let's start the afternoon session. My name is Peter Fenvis, and I'll be moderating it. This isn't my field, but I'm very pleased to be here to moderate a topic that is of great interest, not only to you, scholars of Luther and the Reformation, but also many other scholars in other fields. The topic is rhetoric, emotions, and reason, and we are very pleased to have three of the four panelists here. Birgit Stolt, who has worked on this topic for a very long time and whose book is available out in the lobby, is unfortunately unable to make it today. But three of the four panelists are here, and I believe that we will call them in the order that's listed in the program. So Christine Helmer, a new faculty member, a new colleague of mine from Northwestern, will be first.
The title of my talk is Honest Truth and Liberal Love. And with the talk, I wanted to overcome a traditional blind spot in Luther's theology. Luther's theology is known as true doctrine, and he never really gets to love. And that was the problem in my paper. I talk a lot about truth and don't really get to love, but you'll forgive me, I'm trying to work my way out of this paradigm. My field is systematic theology, and what I'm doing at this point in my thinking about Luther is to recover Luther as a resource for thinking about the function and the role and the task of theology in the contemporary university, in the contemporary academy. There are a lot of things that we can forget Luther ever wrote, but there's some very important aspects of Luther that I think require revisiting, particularly on this issue of truth, which I think has been misinterpreted since Luther spoke some of his claims about truth and falsity. The reason why I'm interested in truth is because theologians, especially theologians since the early part of the 20th century, have been making propositions of truth claims of a theological sort that are supposed to have maximal authority and a maximal claim to truth. And by this stance, theologians have marginalized themselves from a lively intersubjective disputational context in which truth is contested and to be discovered rather than something that is already presupposed or found. So this is the context from which I'm writing, and I do think that Luther can say something to us about truth and truth claims today. Martin Luther's revision of the Christian doctrine of justification is one of the most discussed, debated, and reviled ideas in the West. Luther, by this idea, invented a new way of conceiving the self before God. The self was no longer seen as temporally extended, dressing itself daily with the habitus of love and hoping for justification at life's end. Rather, Luther saw the self as naked before God, indecently exposed, yet immediately and entirely covered by God's merciful embrace. The sinner's total and complete justification are the clothes of Christ, a reality bestowed in the singular time of the present tense. Luther's idea of justification also brought to the Christian religion a new way of grasping the eternal truth of God's mercy. Christ was no longer viewed from the uncertain perspective of ultimate justification. Luther contextualized Christ by manger and cross. The king's humiliation was actualized by his priestly sacrifice, and through this twofold office, the servant of all effects the new creation of kings and priests. Luther's revision of the justifying relationship between self and God uncovers the truth of both, and it does so by reframing love by mercy shown in time. Yet, Luther's truth claim of justification has been more dramatic than the article by which the church stands or falls. It has been the dangerous cliff on which Protestantism has been perched since its origins. And the reason for this is I contend that Luther dramatically dislocated love from justification. He replaced the medieval Catholic formula, fides caritatis formata, faith formed by love, with the sola fide, faith alone without works. Love, then, is erased from the formula of faith. Notice, however, has been taken since the origins of Luther's quotation of this erasure. There were two Strasbourger reformers, Martin Bucer and Katharina Zell. Especially Katharina Zell wrote texts criticizing Luther's one-sided insistence on the truth, and in this particular case, of Christ's real presence in the Eucharist, and argued that the table fellowship initiated by Christ is constituted by love. So Zell chastised Luther's denunciation of the many reformers, Schwenkfeld, Oecolampadius, and insisted that Christianity was a religion of invitation to and not exclusion from the common meal. And I really appreciate the discussion this morning on the psychological factors motivating Luther's hatred and vitriol against those who didn't believe as he did. There are various reasons for Luther's marginalization of the love question. Luther rejected the Aristotelian category of the habitus to explain the moral technology of the self, and instead recommended a therapy of the word. He also has an idea of ecstatic agency, I, not I, but Christ who lives in me. And I think that this also has dangerous implications for undercutting any intersubjective concretion of the reality of love. So the question is, does the fear of tainting Luther's true doctrine drive away the truth of love? From a contemporary perspective, the difficulty of contextualizing love from the perspective of truth is one that has haunted Lutheran theology, particularly since the writing of Eros and Agape, Anders Nygren's very famous book. It's one of the books that actually has been read by those outside of the circle of Luther scholars, a very, very popular book read by cultural historians and anybody who's interested in the topic of love, which I hope is all of you. Even Anders Nygren's desperate attempt in his infamous Eros and Agape to show that God's truth is truly love ends up by contextualizing any intersubjective love in inevitably sinful carnal desire. Eros and Agape are pitted against each other as sin opposes grace. And this conceptuality has exposed Nygren and Lutheran dualist theology with it to the last 10 years of ridicule by scholars tackling the question of the healthy desire in theology. So what I do in this paper is I will look at Luther's understanding of truth and show that the way the tradition has understood Luther to make truth claims is not exactly what Luther is doing. And so then by recovering what I call Luther's epistemological tempering of absolute truth claims, so his contextualizing of truth in the intersubjective context rather than a direct appeal to immediate revelation, is one way in which theologians can start thinking about making truth claims that are contested and can be discussed by people who are not theologians. So Luther's understanding of truth, and the section is called Truth's Critical Potential. Luther's understanding of justification is immediately tied to truth. The freedom of a Christian is sealed and delivered by the truth of Christ's person and work. The truth will set you free. If Christ is the way, the truth, and the life, then Christ sets the captive free from psychological, spiritual, theological, political, and cultural untruths. Thus, the Christ, truth, and freedom correlation of justification circumscribes justification in terms of maximal truth that affects maximal freedom. How Luther construes justification is by putting together two binary opposites. And so now I'm going to talk about the two binary opposites that Luther puts together and try to figure out what Luther might mean by those binary opposites and the conditions under which that association can be said to be true. A concept is constructed out of the two opposing concepts constituting it. With this, Luther's logic is no different than the logic characterizing the Western tradition founded on Plato's insight and emblematized by Porphyry's tree. Nevertheless, a significant distinguishing mark for Luther is that theological concepts are constructed out of a binary opposition that is not only logical, but ontological. God is divided from the human by an infinite chasm, so not just a logical chasm, but an ontological one in reality. The ontological divide between God and the human is such that a binary opposition in the concept forbids any point of identity. And this is why Luther constantly resists any kind of philosophy of identity, any kind of 19th century philosophy of identity to merge those two opposites and have one flip over into the other side. Nevertheless, I will be giving you a Schleiermacherian reading of Luther. Yet for Luther, such a uniting is not possible given the distinct subject matter of God and the human. The logic dissociating God from the human is not one of mutual exclusion, so it's not either God or man. Rather, it is a binary opposition that is united by the logical conjunctive and, God and man. So this is a theological logic. And what Luther effects by this binary opposition that is united between God and man in theological terms is to frame that binary opposition not philosophically but soteriologically in view of his doctrine of salvation. God and the human are driven apart by the criterion of agency in salvation. Only God is the proper agent of salvation. God is the Deus justificans, the justifying God, as the gerund in Luther's Latin indicates. The human is the human determined exclusively by sin. The human is homo peccator, the sinful human, identified in Latin by the noun, not the verb, from which he cannot free himself. Original, actual, and hidden sin are blanketed by the universal claim, all, that Luther takes according to nominalist logic to mean each and every one. There is no exception. Sin plunges humanity into an ontological reality of infinite distance from God. And what I do here is to take that soteriological framing of the conjunction God and man and look at that as the kind of conceptual lens to interpret Luther's very famous truth proposition, God is true or God is truth and humans lie. So Luther's foundational truth proposition is God is the one who only tells the truth all the time and humans lie in every case. So let us consider this proposition. When the proposition God is truth and humans lie is taken perspectively, from the perspective of somebody framing that proposition, a serious epistemological problem emerges. From whose perspective can this claim be taken as true? The epistemological problem of self-reflexivity immediately comes to the fore. So, for example, if taken from the human perspective of untruth, the entire proposition is falsified by the self-reflexive argument that humans lie. If humans lie, then even the human articulation of this proposition cannot be taken as true. In order for the proposition to stand as a truth claim, another perspective must be taken as the perspective from which the proposition can be articulated as true. And this is God's perspective. So I'm using the kind of classic philosophical argument, humans lie, it's from Aristotle, and it's this sort of self-falsifying proposition from the perspective of untruth. One cannot shed light on truth and untruth. Rather, it is only from the perspective of truth that you can shed light and distinguish truth from untruth. So one way in which we can contextualize Luther's claim so as to avoid making this self-reflexive mistake is to work out the conditions under which this statement can be said to be true. And here I'm doing another Aristotelian move. I'm putting Aristotle and Luther as two peas in a pod. Aristotle's theory of truth is in the Perihermeneus on interpretation, and in that text, Aristotle talks about truth as a function of propositions. So S is P is a proposition, and one has to articulate the conditions under which the proposition can be said to be true. And in the situation of humans lie and God tells the truth, it is established that only from God's perspective can the proposition be claimed as true. The problem with this is that in theologies that appeal to direct revelation, God is true, that claim that brings God to earth in an unmediated way is, I argue, plunges one into the self-reflexive problem. So how do we get out of that? It is at this point that nominalist logic can be invoked in order to solve the logical problem of perspective. And Luther himself invokes an argument advanced by Peter Abelard, often considered one of the first nominalist philosophers. For Abelard, the form of the proposition must clearly reflect its status as spoken by someone. Abelard appeals to what he calls the dictum, a kind of prefix to a proposition that he claims conveys the logical status of the proposition as spoken by someone. So you can say, it is said that God tells the truth and humans lie. And by doing that, by prefacing the proposition with this dictum, by announcing that this proposition is actually spoken by someone, the proposition is rendered in indirect speech. This strategy, converting direct to indirect speech, functions to situate the proposition in intersubjective speech in order that its truth can be contested. If you say that God lies and humans, that God tells the truth and humans lie, then I will be able to contest that. But if we say that God says this, then who can argue with God? By recontextualizing the proposition in indirect speech, the proposition becomes part of intersubjective contention. Its claim to truth does not need to be taken at face value. Rather, as a claim articulated by someone, its truth status must be measured by appropriate truth criteria. The proposition's content can now be measured by applying criteria of truth used to measure all propositions. God has become human in speech. Once Luther contextualizes truth claims in the intersubjective arena, and this might sound very surprising to you, I was actually very surprised when I came up with this idea myself. Luther appeals so often to the Holy Spirit as the instrument of God's revelation and doesn't couch that revelation in human terms. God says, and because God tells the truth, therefore it must be true. So what I'm trying to do is show another way of looking at how Luther appropriates the nominalist dictum from Abelard in order to contextualize theological propositions so that they can be the subject matter of contention. And this is exactly what he does in the Disputations. The Disputations are those texts of Luther that have, for the most part, not been translated into English, but are texts that I think are really important in getting a lens on the kind of logic, on the kind of status of theological claims that Luther allocates to theology in a contest, in a situation of debate. Usually, Luther is cited as kind of a proto-neo-Orthodox theologian with an appeal to revelation, but that's not true. Luther is a very fine logician and a little worse of a philosopher, but a very fine logician, and makes these distinctions in his Disputations. So lots of dissertation topics. Okay. In order to resolve this difficulty on how to determine the propositional content, then, of God is truth and humans lie, I appealed to a nominalist semantics from another Peter Lombard, that Luther uses when discussing the truth status of tensed propositions in relation to God. The question here concerns propositions about God that invoke a verb tense. For example, the proposition Christ was made man, God was made man, uses the past tense when referring to Christ's incarnation. Yet for Luther, the question concerns the extension of the incarnation into eternity. Christ was made man and still continues to work human salvation by virtue of the human nature that is united with the divine nature. So Luther appeals to a semantics from Lombard, who himself appropriates it from Augustine. For Augustine, all verbs are inevitably tensed, even when they refer to God. Yet, when they refer to God, the verb tenses should be taken according to a semantics of eternity. The semantics take the verbs in their eternal sense and succeed in attributing to the proposition a truth status in eternity. So back to our example. If we say, Luther says that God tells the truth and humans lie, we can claim that the indirect clause, God tells the truth, should be taken according to a semantics of eternity. And in this sense, Luther's dictum opens up the intersubjective realm of contending truth. And in this case, the contention is answered by the criterion of a semantics of eternity. If the proposition concerning God's truth is taken to refer to God's eternity, then it should be taken as a claim about God's eternity that is characterized by eternal truth. And there are other texts in Luther in which, and I did a lot of work on Luther's kind of semantics of eternity. How does he understand the infinite? This is a question that Luther, I think, has brought into Western philosophy. And what I discovered in Luther is that he understands eternity to be framed by the discourse of the Trinity. So he doesn't begin with the metaphysical categories of infinity or eternity and time. Rather, he begins with the Trinitarian relations in the eternal Godhead and then defines eternity from the perspective of the Trinity rather than the other way around. So he has a very interesting semantics operating. So what I argue is that Luther himself epistemologically tempers some of the theological claims of a kind of a binary oppositional sort that we have come to know and love as the hallmarks of Luther's Reformation. What has happened in the history of interpretation is that the binary oppositional model has too often been used in Protestant theology as a characteristic trait of Protestantism in crisis situations. The Protestant strategy of appealing to God's truth, separated from intersubjective mediation, is used all too frequently as a guarantor of theological truth. Its spirit dangerously haunts Protestant Orthodox appeal to divinely inspired scripture as a guarantor of theological truth. Yet its appearance in current theological thinking is coupled with an anti-incarnational impulse that renders the Spirit's word of truth untouchable by human hands. Since the early part of the 20th century and ongoing to today, Luther's appeal to divine truth has been appropriated as the sword slicing between bone and marrow. The critical potential of Luther's sword is indeed a dangerous doctrine. Truth's critical potential can slice between God and the human in order to separate the two realms and attribute proper attributes and works to the particular subject. And this Luther indeed saw in his truth claim about justification, Deus justificans et homo peccator. The division between these two binary oppositions is one that succeeds in allowing God to be God and man to be man, allowing God to act and humans to receive the complete benefits of that action. Yet the Protestant problem rears its ugly head when Luther's truth claim is taken in an extension over a vast area of propositional claims and disregards the self-referential possibility of falsification and renders the divine human contradictory as a human proposition with maximal truth claims. And I do have one quote. I know there are a few of my German colleagues who have heard Eberhard Jungel, so you will recognize this quote from, I think it's Gott als Geheimnis der Welt, in one of these classic appeals to Luther, Die Wahrheit macht das Wahre wahr. So in this, the truth makes the truth makes the truth true. This Heideggerian sense, to me, is very, very problematic, and it exemplifies the problematic of theology since the early part of the 20th century, where truth becomes reified and rendered independently of human reality, even if that human reality messes things up. So what I propose in recovering something about Luther in order to allow theology or open up theology to the possibility of intersubjective discussion is to epistemologically temper the propositional truth of a sort that Luther would himself have used by casting that truth in the form of human speech. By intersubjectively contextualizing truth claims, the theologian can situate her claims in an arena where truth can be discussed by others. Truth has fundamentally to do with honesty. Theology must recognize that truth is most honest when it is most human, and it must acknowledge that truth can do justice to its subject matter if it is epistemologically honest. Luther, at his best, at his disputational best, respected theology's human contextualization. And even in his extreme appeal to the divine truth perspective, Luther made clear, at least in the disputations, that this perspective was warranted by the propositional content of salvation. Theology should speak, as Luther argues, in such a way that its truth perspective can shed light on truth and falsity. Yet all the while, theology must honestly face its epistemologically human limitations. Honesty makes truth both human and humane. Thank you for your attention.